Okay, well, welcome back. We are rounding the curve, so to say, on the finishing of the Ozarks history. And we'll be doing this for the next 4 weeks or 3 weeks after this one, and we'll be done. And we'll be ready to start a brand new series, which I'm really, really excited about. But we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So today we're going to talk about an event that made the Ozarks, the Shepherd of the Hills. Before 1905, 1900, the Ozarks was one of those places on the map. If you were looked at it from anywhere else in the United States, you would have thought, boy, that's a place I'm never going to go. It's just, there just wasn't anything there to attract people. People just, they considered it a land of nothing, probably more than anything else. People just didn't see it as anything attractive. And then a book came out, The Shepherd of the Hills, in 1906, 1907. And it just set the world on fire. And it also set the Ozarks on fire, as you'll see. And it just absolutely hit the nation like something else. We don't appreciate how important this book was at that time, but we're going to talk about this, and we're going to find out some things about it. The author, of course, was a man by the name of Harold Bell Wright, and that's Harold Bell Wright. He became a very wealthy, very famous man. He was one of the most famous authors in the early 20th century in America. And today, he's just a forgotten man. You could ask most kids today, you could ask most young adults today. You could probably ask most middle-aged adults today. Do you know who Harold Bell Wright was? And if you didn't live in the Ozarks, you'd probably look at him like, huh? I don't have a clue who that is. Folks, he was as famous as any writer in America in the early 20th century. So let's look a little bit about this, okay? If any one event brought the Ozarks region to the attention of the nation, it had to be the publication of The Shepherd of the Hills in 1907. And like I've said, today, although he's a largely forgotten author, no novelist in the early first quarter of the 20th century had a larger audience. Look at this. In an era when authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who is generally credited as being probably the greatest author of the first half of the 20th century in America, when he was struggling to sell 50,000 books a year at all, Wright was selling 1 million. It's generally thought that he was the first American novelist to sell over 1 million copies of one of his books, and generally considered to be the first American novelist to become a millionaire solely based on his books. Now, it's true, people like Mark Twain had sold a lot of books, and Mark Twain was a wealthy man, but his wealth came primarily from investments. It wasn't that his books were that big wide sellers. Harold Bell Wright's books were kind of in the vein of like a John Grisham book. It wasn't great literature. It was just good reading. Nobody was ever going to say, even Harold Bell Wright said, I never intended to create great literature. I only meant to minister to people. They were religious themed, but they had elements about them that have very much appealed to the secular audience. Between 1902 and 1942, Wright wrote 19 books, several stage plays, many magazine articles. In addition, there were 13 movies made from his stories, most notably The Winnie to Barbara Worth, and without a doubt, the biggest one was The Shepherd of the Hills in 1941, starring, at that time, still a pretty not well-known actor by the name of John Wayne. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie The Shepherd of the Hills of John Wayne. I'll be honest with you, it's not my favorite movie because it really doesn't stay very well with the book. But it's a good movie. It's just that if you know the book, it's just not quite the same. So there is the original book, the 1907 version of Shepherd of the Hills. One of my treasures that I did not give up is a first edition. I have that very book right there. And it's not hard to find. You can find them down in flea markets and antique stores. I just happened on one day, and picked it up, knowing that that was the original one, the first one that came out. And I picked it up and purchased it. But if you ever see one like that, that's the first edition, the Shepherd of the Hills with the woman and the man on it. So let's look a little bit about Harold Bell Wright. What was he? Wright was born in Rome, New York, May 4th, 1872, to William and Alma Wright. His father was a Civil War veteran, and unfortunately, he was a lifelong alcoholic. Probably, a lot of them probably were as a result of the Civil War. The result was that Wright's family pretty much descended into poverty as a young man. They never had much. On the other hand, he absolutely loved his mother. He said she was a saint. She nurtured his emotional, his academic, his moral qualities. She taught him the beauty in nature. He absolutely had nothing but good things to say about his mother. Unfortunately, she died when he was 11. And his father just basically abandoned the family and just sent him out. And for a few years, Wright lived with relatives and just kind of was passed around. Happened a lot, folks. That happened to my mother. Her mother died when she was about the same age in the 1930s, and her father had already abandoned the family, and she was raised basically by aunts, So it wasn't that uncommon that this kind of thing happened. By the age of about 14 or 15, Wright just struck out on his own. He was basically living a life of homelessness. He basically lived under bridges, out in barns where he could find a place. That's a picture of Wright as a young man. Now, that's not while he was doing all this, because there are no pictures of him. And this would have been about the age when he wrote The Shepherd of the Hills. These photographs would have been taken about 1907, 1908, something like that. And here's another picture of him as a young man. Like I said, he spent most of his teen years just living the vagabond life. He made a living by painting houses. He would, approach people and ask them if he could paint their house. And as while he was doing it, he kind of realized he had a talent for painting. And he started doing a little bit of scribbling and drawing and painting. He thought, hey, I'm not too bad at this, am I? And so he began to have thoughts about maybe an artistic career. But all along, what he really wanted to do was be a minister. His mother had kind of instilled this in him. He had a very strong background of morality, and he managed to get into a little college called Hiram College in Ohio, and privately funded a little college. And I understand from Pastor Dwayne, it was kind of one of those colleges where they went out of their way to help people that were in need. And so anyway, he went in and he spent 2 years there, studied religion. But he wasn't a real strong young man, probably as a result of all the years he spent out living on his own. He ended up basically having a lot of physical problems. He was kind of stressed a lot mentally. And as a result, he finally dropped out of college after 2 years and moved to Western Missouri to once again live with some relatives and try to restore his youth. While he was there, he was living in Pierce City, Missouri, which is about halfway between here and Joplin. And he lived in a little town called Pierce City, and they needed a preacher. The local Small Disciples of Christ Church did. And they found out that Wright had been to a religious school, a ministry school, and they said, hey, why don't you take over the ministry of this? And so he decided to take over the pastorship of the church. And he was there for a couple of years, actually about 5, I believe. And then he was so good at it that he was hired to go over to Pittsburgh, Kansas, which is quite a bit larger community. Pittsburgh, Kansas was a pretty good sized community back and even in these days. And while he was in Pittsburgh, 3 really important events occurred. First of all, he married his first wife, Frances Long, who had been at Hiram College. And they would stay together for 20 years. They had 3 sons, just almost right after the other. And he began to write a story. He said that what happened was this. He decided that his parishioners might be interested in a story with religious overtones to be read to them of an evening, a Sunday evening. And so he decided to write kind of like a serialized story called That Printer of Udell's. And he began to write this, and he began to read it to his audience, his parishioners, and they loved it. And they said, this is really good. Maybe you ought to publish this. And so the Disciples of Christ National Fellowship found out about it, and they agreed to publish it in their journal. And it was a real success. And Wright began to wonder, said, maybe I could make a living writing. Maybe this is what I'm meant to do. On top of that, his physical health and his mental health was once again beginning to kind of break down. As it turned out, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and that probably had a lot to do with this. But he decided that he needed to take some time off from his ministry out in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and kind of restore himself. And one of his friends back in Pierce City said, hey, I know some people down in the hills and hollers of southern Missouri in the Ozarks where you can go there and you can spend the summer. We've got a big tent. You can just kind of restore and recuperate. And so that's what happened. That's the book, The Printer of Udell's. That was the first one that he published. It was before The Shepherd of the Hills. And that is the church at Pierce City. It still stands. They had a really bad tornado there several years ago and destroyed much of downtown Pierce City. But it's my understanding the church still stands. And it's a museum to Harold Bell Wright today, if you're interested in that. So, summer of 1903, Wright traveled with his companion from Aurora, Missouri, down to Branson. Now, Branson was just it was a hamlet. I don't even know. I don't think it was even incorporated in 1903. And from there, they walked to a place called Mutton Hollow. Now, if you were to go to Mutton Hollow today, you would be basically out on the strip of Branson. But back in those days, it was about 10 miles west of Branson, in the middle of absolutely nowhere. He was introduced to Georgiana and John Ross and their son Charles. And they welcomed in and they said, sure, hey, we got a really nice place out here on the south of our property and we call it Inspiration Point because you can see far, far away. And so they took him out there and he pitched a tent and he spent the summer there. And it was so good to him that for the next 3 years, he would take his summers off and go back down to Mutton Hollow and spend 3 or 4 months living in this tent at Inspiration Point. But more importantly, what he was doing also in his mind was formulating another book. He was trying to come up with an idea for another book. And while he was down there, he got the idea of writing what would become The Shepherd of the Hills. He no doubt heard the tales of the Bald Knobbers, this vigilante group that we talked about some months back. He had also heard about the woods colts roaming the hills. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a woods colt is just an Ozarks term for a child of an illegitimate child. That's what they called them back in those days. He heard about the deep and mysterious cave that became Marble Cave. He watched Charles, the son of John and Georgiana, have a romance with a lovely young girl by the name of Grace Shear. And all this was kind of swirling around in his mind. And by the end of the summer of 1905, after his third summer there, he accepted the ministry in a church in Lebanon. And while he was there that winter, he wrote the book that became The Shepherd of the Hills. So that's how The Shepherd of the Hills came about. Published in 1907, and it was just an instant success, folks. I mean, it was as big as any book has ever been as far as publication in the history of the United States up to that point. Like I said, it was just gigantic. There's a very, very, very old picture of Mutton Hollow and Inspiration Point. Sure looks different than today. Trust me. If you're familiar with Branson, you're not going to see anything like that anymore. We you can see the vista, but it's definitely different from that. So let's look at the plot of the Shepherd of the Hills. I don't want to do I guess I should say here's a spoiler alert. If you've never read the book and you want to read the book, you might want to shut your ears for the next few minutes. But really, I'm not going to tell you that much of it. The plot of the novel involves a relationship between old Matt and a man by the name of Dad Howitt. Old Matt was a native of the Ozarks who had lost his only daughter, Maggie, in childbirth. The father was a mysterious young man from the city by the name of Howard. And Howard seemingly abandoned Maggie before she had the child. Now, as it turns out in the book, we find out that Howard didn't know she was pregnant, and Howard felt like he had to go back home to his parents. Her son was named Little Pete, and Little Pete, in a sense, he was born illegitimate because Howard didn't even know he existed. And turns out that Maggie dies in childbirth, again, which is not as unusual. And Little Pete has some serious handicaps. And the result is that he's kind of just turns out to be almost like a little feral animal, roaming the hills, suffering what most people thought was mental illness, living in Marble Cave. Part of the time, just, he was just like a wild child, in a sense. Into this situation walks a man by the name of Howitt, some years after Pete's birth, and he becomes a shepherd to the natives. But he has a secret. He's the father of Howard, who had impregnated Maggie and later apparently committed suicide. I say apparently, okay? It was their understanding that he had killed himself. So Howard has come to the hills to amend for his sins, his son's sins. He finds out that Maggie had died in childbirth and that she had had a child. And so he's so guilt-ridden about this, that his son had done this, that he decides to come to the Ozarks to help the people in any way he can. He's a big city minister from Chicago. As it turns out, Howard really hasn't died. And Howard is actually living in Marble Cave himself. And he's unknown. This is unknown to anybody but his son, Little Pete. He is becoming, he's become a father to Little Pete. Little Pete can't talk about this because his mental condition is that he can't communicate very well. The climax of the novel occurs with the accidental death of Howard, the subsequent death of Little Pete, and Howitt's secret being revealed to old Matt and Aunt Molly. And as you might imagine, old Matt is so upset, he fumes, he's mad, but in the end, he realizes that that's not going to accomplish anything. He forgives Howard, and Howard and the shepherd says, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here making amends by ministering to the hill folks of Mutton Hollow. That is the basic plot of the Shepherd of the Hills. This is a scene, a film clip, or not a film clip, but it's still from the movie. This is Dad Howitt, the big city preacher, and this is old Matt, the patriarch of the family there. Now, there is a subplot, and the subplot has a lot to do with the book. A subplot to the story of the Shepherd of the Hills involves a romance between old Matt and Aunt Molly's son, called Young Matt, and Sammy Lane. She's this just, beautiful, beautiful creature. She's a wood nymph. She rides her horse without abandon through the hills and the hollers. She's beautiful. She's wild. Her and young Matt, are in love, but she's torn because she wants to be a lady, and she doesn't think she can do that in Mutton Hollow. She wants to become a young lady, and she wants to learn, and she wants to be sophisticated, and she thinks, I can't do that if I stay here in Mutton Hollow. Complicating the romance are some other suitors. One of them is a young man by the name of Ollie Stewart. He's a city slicker. He's gone to Springfield and got educated, and he wants to take Sammy out of the hills and makes her a lady. The problem is Sammy Lane doesn't like Ollie, or she likes him. He's just, he's not enough of a man for her. And then there's Wash Gibbs. He's the villain of the book. And Wash Gibbs is the leader of the Ball Knobbers, and he also wants Sammy for his wife. And involved in all this is Sammy Lane's father, Jim Lane, who used to be a Ball Knobber, but now he's gone right, and he's struggling with Sammy's choice. Gibbs wants to discredit young Matt. Wash Gibbs decides he's going to hatch a plot to make sure that young Matt doesn't win Sammy's attention. And so he performs a robbery that he thinks young Matt will be blamed for. In the process, Jim Lane is killed. Mad Howard, the father of Little Pete, is accidentally shot by posse and is killed. And it's just all a big mess. As it turns out, everything turns out for good. Young Matt and Sammy, they end up getting married. They live happily ever after. She realizes she doesn't have to leave Mutton Hollow to be a lady, and the shepherd is going to be their minister for the rest of their life. So there's the young John Wayne and the actors that played Sammy Lane in the movie. So that's the plot. Now, here's where the story gets interesting to me. All along, Harold Bell Wright said that these people were fictional. He said, that really this was all fiction, and you can read that on any book. They always say this is a fictional account, and the people are not based on any real people. That's because they don't want to get sued. Okay, there is absolutely no doubt in most people's minds that Harold Bell Wright used people that he saw and met in Mutton Hollow for the basis for the characters of the book. So like I said, this is where it gets interesting, because these people actually existed. Now, the plot didn't exist, but the people existed. Some of the people that he used in the book were gratified about it. Grace Shearer, who many think was Wright's inspiration for Sammy Lane, was so upset about the whole thing when the book came out that she left the Ozarks and never returned. She was mortified. She thought that it was just horrible. On the other hand, another young girl that sometimes is thought as an inspiration of Sammy was a young girl by the name of Susie Morrell. And she was said to have been so happy with the book and so proud of it that she ended up setting up a tourist attraction in downtown Branson, where tourists that would come in looking for the Shepherd of the Hills character, she'd say, "Hey, I'm Sammy Lane, and you can ride my horse here for 50 cents. First tourist attraction to Branson, I guess. So, Wright, as I said, Wright always maintained that other than the Rosses, who were portrayed as Aunt Molly and old Matt, he fully said these were the Rosses, and that his son was young Matt. And there was also a character by the name of Uncle Ike, who was the postmaster. He was put full force into the book as Uncle Ike. Other than that, he said that these characters absolutely did not mess up. But like I said, most people know the background of the area, knew better. And, there was no doubt in most people's minds who he was writing about. So let's look at some of these people, because this is how tourism folks started in Branson. People came to Branson as a result of the book looking for these people. And so that's how it all started. That's Harold Bell Wright about the time of the 1920s when he was a famous author. That the old Branson Hotel, downtown Branson, still stands now. It's a bed and breakfast. And that's where he would stay. And they say that when he came to Branson, he was pretty much shunned. A lot of people didn't really like what he had done in the area, because the book is kind of, it's not real gracious to the people of the Ozarks. So Aunt Matt, old Matt and Aunt Molly by Wright's on a mission was John and Georgiana Ross. And that's a picture of John and Georgiana Ross there. Ross was born in Pennsylvania, moved to Springfield in 1879. He was a carpenter, but there was a big panic in 1895. He sold everything he had and moved to Fall Creek down in the rugged, remote area of Taney County, where Mutton Hollow is. And so he moved just about as far away from everything as he could get. After clearing the land, he began farming. It eventually built a mill which served the local community. This is one of the first things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago that was always done. They've always built a mill to grind the corn and to provide food and all. Soon after Wright left for good, he sold his land, moved to Garber. Garber no longer exists. It's kind of like a little ghost town north of Branson. And he operated a general store and a postmaster until both he and his wife died in 1923. So without a doubt, old Matt and Aunt Molly in the book were John and Georgiana Ross. Wright fully admitted that. That's old Matt's cabin. It's still part of the Shepherd of the Hills homestead, which is, they have an outdoor pageant there now, which is part of the original Branson tourist trade. So that's the cabin that they lived in. Young Matt was without a doubt based on Charles Ross. Now, John Ross's son, Charles, was clearly, like I said, the model for young Matt. But there was a lot of differences between the actual Charles and young Matt in the book. First of all, in the book, young Matt is almost like a little Abner character. He's big, he's brawny, but he's not too brainy. And that's probably one of the reasons that people didn't appreciate what Harold Bell Wright had done, because he was portrayed as kind of a, not dim-witted, but not very smart. Pardon me. He was actually a very highly educated young man and very, very intelligent. In fact, he's the one that designed and built the mill that the Rosses run. And folks, that's no easy job. I don't know if you know anything about these old mills, but they were complicated things. And you had to be pretty smart to be able to know how to build one of these things and to run them. He was known to have kept company with Grace Shearer, as well as some other young ladies. Apparently he was a very handsome young man, and a lot of the young ladies in Mutton Hollow area kind of liked him. Eventually, Charles moved to California, married a girl from Ava by the name of Ellen Faulkner, spent the rest of his life there as an engineer in California in some of the mines. Fortunately, he died of a motorcycle accident in 1934. So there's, again, no doubt that young Matt was based on Charles. And that's Charles and another man, I'm really not for sure who it is, at the original mill. Folks, that mill still serves as the backdrop to the Shepherd of the Hills pageant. If you've never been there and you go, when you're looking at this outdoor play that's going on, you're looking at the original mill that old Matt, John Ross, and Charles Ross built. So Sammy Lane is a very important character in the book. A lot of people think she's kind of a composite of three different people: Grace Shearer, Susie Morrell, and a girl by the name of Emma Isaacs. In fact, Isaacs always said that Grace was the beauty, Susie had the horse, and I had the brains. So who knows? That's Grace Shearer over here to the side. Most believe it was Grace, though, that was the main inspiration. When young Wright was living down in Mutton Hollow, getting this book in his mind, he would have known her because she was being courted by Charles Ross, and she was only 19, and indeed she kind of fit the pattern. In fact, the rumor in the community was that Wright was just a little bit smitten with the girl. He was married and he was a minister, but he apparently was pretty taken with her, and if you read the book, you can almost see it. She is just portrayed as just like no girl has ever been. I mean, he was just absolutely, he wrote her up like she was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So what's known for sure is she did not appreciate the attention of the book. And because people would come to Branson looking for Sammy Lane, and everybody said, well, that's Grace Shearer. She lives out here. She got so upset about all this that she moved to Enid, Oklahoma, and lived there most of the rest of her life. She ended up being a widow 3 times. She married 3 different men. They all died on her. And she died in 1955 in Florida, where she'd lived for the rest of her life. This, I believe, is Susie Morrell at a place called Sammy's Lookout. This is one of those places that tourists would come to look because it's talked about in the book. And so tourists would come looking for Sammy's Lookout. The Shepherd of the Hills actually, as you're going to find out next week, started a whole new type of tourism in America called literary tourism, where people were so enthralled with the book that they would go looking for the places that was in the book because they wanted to experience it for themselves. And that was one of those places, Sammy's Lookout. Now, Jim Lane was Sammy Lane's father. And most people think that that was based on Matthias Shearer, who was Grace Shearer's father. He was born in Ohio, moved to Mutton Hollow in 1889, homesteaded on Dewey Bald, near what became known as Sammy's Lookout, just like in the book. It mentions Dewey Bald and Sammy's Lookout. And like Jim Lane, he was a quiet man. He was large, but he didn't really, he was kind of reclusive. And that fits with Matthias Shearer, and it also describes Jim Lane in the book. But unlike in the book, he was absolutely never suspected of being involved in a ball knob or any other kind of criminal thing. In fact, he was actually an herb doctor. He was actually one of those kind of guys that we talked about that would minister to the local people. But in lacking a doctor, he was kind of like an herb doctor and helped heal them. So he was a good, kind, generous man. He just didn't really, he wasn't really a socialized type person. Lived on Dewey Bald the rest of his life, died in 1925. And there's the original Jim Lane cabin. And again, this is one of those places people would come to see. And it burned in 1922. It's been restored. People rebuild it now, and you can still see Jim Lane's cabin if you go to, the Shepherd of the Hills area. So who was the shepherd? The big city preacher from Chicago, the father of Mad Howard that came down to repent of his son's sins and minister to the folks, the Shepherd of the Hills. Well, most people think it was a man by the name of Truman Powell because he absolutely fit the model of the shepherd. He was born in Chicago, and just like Dad Howard, his father was a minister of a large church. He wasn't a minister, but his father was. He was a Civil War veteran, had been with Sherman marching through the South, and after the Civil War, like a lot of veterans, all he wanted to do was hide. After what he witnessed in the war, he just didn't want to be around people anymore. So he moved to Lamar, Missouri, started a newspaper, and eventually by the 1880s, he ends up down in Taney County mining Marvel Cave. As you'll find out next week, Marvel Cave in the beginning was Marble Cave, and it was a mining operation. And it wasn't until later somebody decided it would be a good tourist destination. It's well known that just like the shepherd in the book, he was a kind, intelligent man, started the first school at Notch, Missouri. If you've ever been to Silver Dollar City, right across the road, the entrance to Silver Dollar City is Notch. And he built the first school, code, and later on served in the Missouri State Legislature before passing away in 1919. So he absolutely fit the mold of the shepherd in every way possible. So there's no doubt that Powell was the inspiration for part of it. Now, in all honesty, Wright probably wrote a little bit of himself into the book too. Now, who was Ollie Stewart? Now, Ollie Stewart, remember, is one of those characters that was squiring, courting Sammy Lane. He wanted him her for his wife. Probably that was Truman Powell's son, Ralph Waldo Emerson Powell. Obviously, Truman Powell liked authors, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson Powell. But just like Ollie, he spent his youth in Taney County, but moved to Springfield, went to Drury College, and by everybody's admission, he was kind of a dandy. He liked to dress up and he liked to wear fine clothing and all. But unlike Ollie in the book, he loved the Ozarks, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. In the book, Ollie is portrayed as somebody that all he wants to do is get out of the hills because he's embarrassed by being a hillbilly, and he's actually now in the play and all, he's almost like a cartoon character. It's he's been written up as just almost like a caricature. In reality, he was the owner of several businesses, one of the first real tourist attractions, Fairy Cave, and he also served in the Missouri legislature just like his dad. And he's the man that actually sponsored the creation of the Missouri Department of Conservation, which we talked about the other day. And I told you it was one of the models in this country for conservation commissions. And that was due in no small part to Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Uncle Ike is just kind of a small character in the book, but he's really important because number one, he really did exist. And number two, he was put into book full blown as Uncle Ike. And he is a real character in his own right. Born in Portland, Maine in 1837, graduating from Bowdoin College at the age of 15, quite an accomplishment. Went to work for Horace Greeley as a newspaper man. Eventually ended up moving west into Mutton Hollow. And it was he that persuaded the government to establish a post office at Notch. And he ran that until his death at the age of 89 in 1926. Folks, he became a living tourist attraction. When people came to the Ozarks looking for all the stuff about the Shepherd of the Hills, everybody said, well, if you want to meet Uncle Ike, he's out there at the post office at Notch. And they couldn't believe it. There it was. There was the post office and there was Uncle Ike, who was put full blown into the book. And he played it to the hilt. And that's Uncle Ike standing in front of his little post office at Notch, Missouri. And he was there to 1926. And like I said, he was like a living tourist attraction to the people. And he played it to the hilt. He knew how to do it. Wash Gibbs was probably kind of a fictional character based on maybe some real life people. We know that Wash Middleton was one of the more notorious ball knobbers that killed Sam Snap, who was one of Captain Kenny's arch enemies. If you remember way back, we talked about the ball knobbers, and Wash Middleton was an integral part of the ball knobbers. And so, his name was probably bandied about a lot down in Mutton Hollow. There was a man by the name of Gibbs May that lived on Rorick Creek. And just like Wash Gibbs in the book, he was kind of bullish and kind of an ornery character. So I would imagine, and most people imagine, that probably Wright used Wash Middleton and Gibbs May as kind of a combination, a compilation of these two characters to make Wash Gibbs. Probably a good thing that Gibbs May and Hannibal Wright never met up. That might not have been good for Hannibal Wright. Little Pete was totally fictional, and there's no indication that Little Pete actually existed. But there were legends about these woods colts that were almost like feral creatures that ran around the hills and the hollers of Ozarks. One of the most famous one was a little character called Slimsy Jimsy Harden, who had met up with a young man by the name of Colonel Dewey, who was the inspiration for Dewey's Balls in the early 1800s. And I would imagine this was probably talked about when Wright was having his meetings and his dinners and all with the Rosses, and they probably brought up the legend of Slimsy Jimsy Harden. And it was probably one of those things that he probably whirled around in his mind and used. So what happened to Wright? Okay. Well, after the publication of Shepherd of the Hills, Wright just I mean, he became fabulously wealthy, folks. And he would spend the remainder of his life traveling the West. He had several houses. He would go in the summers and spend it in the Caribbean, places like Barbados. Not a bad life for 1920. Not a bad life for 2022. He divorced his first wife, remarried again, a lady by the name of Winifred Duncan. They lived together for the rest of their life. He had a home in Tucson, Arizona. He had a home in Palm Springs, California. But like I said, he would spend the summers sometimes living in the desert or out on one of these islands in the Caribbean. It was kind of his habit to take the summers off from writing and what all and go just spend the summers recuperating somewhere. Like I said, he suffered from tuberculosis the rest of his life. Finally caught up with him in 1944 and died of his age in his sleep at the age of 72. At that time, that would have been thought of as an older man. Today, I like to think it was just middle age. This is a postcard of his house in Tucson, Arizona. So you can see he lived a pretty good life, folks. Harold Bell Wright, as it turned out, really made a fortune off these books. If you've never read The Shepherd of the Hills and you're interested in the Ozarks, you really need to read it. Now, I'm telling you, it's not great literature, and it's written in the language of 120 years ago. It's kind of corny. It's very derogatory towards the Ozarks in its own way, but it's got a good story, and it gives you an image of what people thought about the Ozarks back in these days. And like I said, most importantly, folks, it absolutely made the Ozarks a national phenomenon. If you can say anything started the tourist industry, the Ozarks, and if you don't know it, tourism is the number 2 industry in the state of Missouri, mostly associated with the area around Branson. Branson is a major tourist attraction for the rest of the United States right now. And it all is because of the Shepherd of the Hills. You can lay it right at Harold Bell Wright's footsteps. Now, some people don't like that. I'm not going to lie to you. Some people would prefer that we weren't the tourist destination, but it most definitely is that way. So next week, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the beginnings of the tourist industry in the Ozarks, because it is a huge thing today. So I appreciate it. I hope you've been interested. Hope you've listened, and looking forward to next week talking about tourism. We'll talk about the beginnings of Marble Cave. We'll talk about Silver Dollar City. We'll talk about all these things. So have a good evening, and go Kansas City Chiefs. So I'll let you